Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest project by Nas, The Lost Tapes 2. This is the follow-up project to the original Lost Tapes album that Nas dropped many years back, a project that consisted of several unreleased songs of his, and overall, despite the fact that, typically these kinds of releases don't tend to be super interesting and mostly tend to cater to hardcore fans who maybe just want to hear a bit extra from an artist they really like, the original Lost Tapes album ended up being a really fantastic project, definitely up there, at least for me personally, as one of my favorite Nas albums, and I know I'm not alone in thinking that. Despite the fact that that was a collection of unreleased songs recorded over the course of these sessions for various different albums, it all came together in a nice, cohesive, and just really enjoyable package in the form of the Lost Tapes. Coming into the Lost Tapes 2, however, I wasn't exactly expecting to get the same thing here. Don't get me wrong, I still think Nas has the potential to put together a really solid project, but the possibility of lightning striking twice here with this thing in the form of another collection of unreleased songs that happen to work together in such a nice way like the original Lost Tapes did, I just didn't really expect it to happen necessarily, and for the most part I came into this project expecting what I would typically expect from an album like this. Maybe some solid cuts, maybe some underwhelming material as well, but maybe just an interesting look into what could have been at the same time. Overall, The Lost Tapes 2 ends up being exactly what I expected it to be coming into it. It's essentially just a collection of unreleased tracks, some of which are pretty decent, some of which are kind of underwhelming too, and it's kind of obvious why they maybe didn't make it onto a full-length studio project. Structurally, this album is a bit more all over the place when compared to its predecessor as well. It covers from the recording sessions of Hip Hop Is Dead up through Nasir, and I guess it does make sense for it to sound all over the place, and for this kind of project it is to be expected. However, when compared to the original Lost Tapes, which sounded so tight and cohesive, I can't help but feel a little bit disappointed, I guess. When you look at this thing in the context of what it is, just a collection of unreleased songs, I can't really fault it too much for that, however. Overall, the quality of the songs on this project, as I said previously, is a bit all over the place as well. You do have some cuts on this thing that are pretty good, just serviceable tracks with some pretty solid lyrics to them that I think would have been pretty interesting to see make it onto a full-length project. You also have some songs on here that just feel a bit more forgettable. When it comes to all the elements present in them, they're pretty, fine for what they are, but they're just not super exciting, and I can kind of see why they were left off of a full-length project. And there are a few songs mixed in here as well that I just don't really like for one reason or another. The album starts off with a couple of the stronger tracks on this thing, No Bad Energy and Vernon Family. I feel like these tracks have some of the stronger production on this thing, and I think Nas's flows on these tracks, as well as his lyrics, are amongst the best in the entirety of the Lost Tapes too. I do want to say that when it comes to this project as a whole, and when it comes to Nas's lyricism on this thing, there are some pretty, standout moments here, but I wouldn't say any, lyrics on this project, any bars or verses really stand among Nas's best. Towards the middle of the album, you get some more solid cuts from Nas, like Lost Freestyle, for example, or Who Are You? Even cuts like Adult Film, for example, I think are pretty, serviceable for what they are. Towards the back end of the album, the only track that I really thoroughly enjoy is the song Queensbridge Politics, and that kind of leads me into my next point about the album, that being the songs on here that I think are just a bit more forgettable and a bit more uninteresting. And unfortunately, I think a lot of these songs are kind of condensed into the last half of the album or so, which leaves the back end of this project feeling a lot more forgettable and uninteresting when compared to the first part. Tracks like War Against Love, The Art of It, Highly Favored, It Never Ends, for example. These songs are ones that I don't think are necessarily bad, like when it comes to how they're put together and constructed. They all, for the most part, work. They have, decent production to them. Nas's flows are pretty okay. His lyrics, for the most part, are pretty solid as well. It's just that these songs don't stand out to me in a way that makes me want to return to them. They're fine enough tracks, but they're not songs that I would have been super excited seeing make their way onto a full-length studio release. The song Royalty is one where I like the verses that Nas brings to the table. However, I'm not the biggest fan of the very R&B inspired hook on this thing. It seems like this track is trying to be this hip-hop R&B crossover that I just really do not care for. I'm not the biggest fan of the sound and the vibe that this thing really just shoots for. I mean, like I said, I think Nas's flow and his verses on this thing are pretty okay. It's just the overall product that gets made here isn't one for me. Truth be told, the same thing can be said for the closing track on this thing, Beautiful Life, as well, which once again, while it features some more detailed verses from Nas, features another really overdramatic sung hook that I just don't care for. As I also said previously, there are some songs and just some moments on this thing, generally speaking, where I don't really like what the project tries to go for. Probably the biggest example of this is the track Jeru of Rap, which is this weird, definitely, at least by Nas's own standards, experimental track with this kind of odd, off-kilter sounding beat and this really odd flow that he brings here. I do like the fact here that he's stepping out of his comfort zone, especially when you consider the fact that so much of this project, I would say, falls very comfortably in a lot of these styles and sounds that Nas has played around with on his previous works, which, given that this is a collection of tracks from previous works, makes sense. But this song is just so goofy and silly and just doesn't come together to be an enjoyable package. This very goofy, silly sounding beat mixed together with Nas's kind of odd flow just makes for a really surreal experience. And I don't mean that necessarily in a good way. Yeah, I feel like this track is one that would have been better off staying lost. Overall, The Lost Tapes 2 ends up being exactly what you would expect from a project like this coming from Nas, I guess you could say. If you completely ignore the fact that the first Lost Tapes project was as great as it was. But like I said before, a project like that coming together as nicely as it did is a bit of a fluke. A very good fluke, don't get me wrong, but it's not something I would ever expect to happen again, and given the fact that all the songs on this project come from completely different sessions than the ones on the first Lost Tapes, it's kind of unfair to come into this album expecting another Lost Tapes, even if it is, called The Lost Tapes 2. If you come into this thing expecting unreleased material from Nas, just, completely ignoring the fact that the first Lost Tapes was as solid as it was, this becomes a bit more of an enjoyable experience, I would say. I wouldn't say it's a super enjoyable listening experience from front to back as a whole, product. I will say this is definitely an album where I think picking out some of your favorite tracks and coming back to those is probably something that's going to happen to a lot of people, but given the nature of this project, I guess that's to be expected. And Nas does bring some solid tracks on this thing that are worth coming back to, in my opinion. Like I said, on some of the strongest cuts on this thing, they feature some really nice flows from Nas, some nice storytelling as well, some pretty decent production too, especially by Nas's own standards, but I guess that's what's going to happen when you have artists like RZA and Kanye West coming in to do production on some of these songs. Yeah, the best of what this album has to offer is pretty enjoyable, especially to Nas fans. Like most albums in this vein that are essentially just collections of unreleased material, however, The Lost Tapes 2 certainly comes with its fair share of baggage, and by that I mean tracks that just aren't super memorable. I think if you're a more hardcore fan of Nas than I am, you might find some of these tracks a bit more interesting, but to me personally, a good portion of this album's runtime just isn't super memorable. Overall, The Lost Tapes 2 ends up being a pretty okay collection of unreleased material. I think for the hardcore fans of Nas out there, this album will definitely give you something to chew on, but if you don't fall into that category of being a super hardcore fan of Nas, or at least East Coast hip-hop, this is an album where I think, running through it a couple times and picking out your best tracks is probably what's going to end up happening. But yeah, overall that is just my own personal opinion on this project. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. Thank you guys for watching once again, and stay golden.